Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Don Marsh. 25 years ago, cresting floodwaters were making a bad situation worse here as the Great Flood of '93 was at its peak. The Mississippi and Missouri rivers were out of control. In all, it was a 5-month calamity, killing 50, causing some $15 billion in damage, and inundating about 30,000 square miles. We'd like to hear your memories. Give us a call at 382-8255. Joining me in studio with their memories are Bill Greenblatt, staff photographer with UPI. Mary Leonard is a reporter with St. Louis Public Radio. In '93, she was with the Post-Dispatch, editing flood-related copy. Paul Schenkman, owner of Paul Schenkman Productions, is a former reporter for KTVI. Thank you all so much for being with us. 25 years. Wow. Doesn't time fly? Bill, let me start with you, and I'll ask the same question of all of you. What's your most vivid memory of that summer?
Well, probably the propane tank situation down in South St. Louis, where the tanks were actually bubbling, leaking, and a great area of South St. Louis was evacuated for a long time.
I remember hearing as well that if those things had exploded, would have wiped out Dupo.
Yeah, it would have caused a lot of problems. So, fire chief at the time, Neil Svitanix, decided to evacuate. I forgot exactly how many square miles it was, but it was. People had to leave immediately. They left birds, they left dogs, cats, and they had to leave immediately.
A lightning bolt could have struck in that vicinity; it would have blown.
But I remember flying over it every day to take pictures of that.
At a high altitude, I hope.
Yeah. And so that was one of the things I did every day is I had to fly every day over that to see what the condition was of the tanks. Take pictures. That
was quite an episode. Paul Schenkman, your recollections?
Well, the thing that came to mind first when I started thinking back on this that I had forgotten about was how hot it was. Usually when we're covering floods, we think about it as being sort of a springtime event, maybe in the fall. But it was really, really hot that summer, and people were just falling out, doing all those sandbags and everything. The other memory I have is actually a happy one, or at least a happier story, which was the National Guard couple that got married down in the church in Festus. I think it was the Baptist church down there. And we covered that. It was on a weekend, and they knew each other before, but they had been on duty, as I recall, both, at the same time, National Guard in that area, and just decided to go ahead and get married at the church. I don't remember if they left by boat. It's been so long, but I know it was still flooding down there.
It has been a long time ago, and some of those memories are a little bit dusty, if you will, but a lot of them are still very vivid. How about yours, Mary Leonard?
Standing on the steps at the Gateway Arch, looking at the river flowing by. And for anybody who doesn't or can't remember or was too young to recall or wasn't born yet, I would suggest go to the Gateway Arch and find the plaques on the stairs, on the grand staircase, and those plaques on either side of the steps will designate how high the river was, and it was like halfway up the staircase at the arch. And Mr. Greenblatt there has a wonderful photo that I think we're using in our web story, showing people on the arch steps looking at the water. It's just almost impossible to imagine that the river could be that high.
We solicited comment from our listeners on Twitter and also on Facebook asking for their recollections, and I'm reminded of a tweet that Bax sent us saying, I worked downtown one day during the floods. I was walking along Market Street toward the arch and noticed that the riverboats, the ones you normally could not see unless you walked to the top of the hill above the river, were now at eye level. The Mississippi was that high.
Well, that was the flood where the boat broke loose, wasn't it, and hit the
Poplar Street Bridge. Yeah, no question about it. Bill, in terms of photographing something like this event was so enormous. It must have been difficult for you. I mean, you could just point your camera anywhere and you get plenty of water, but to get a perspective on your various shots, that must have been kind of tough.
Yeah, it was really hard because you didn't know what the big story of the day was. And, I listened to the radio, watch TV, and see who was rounding up cattle one day or evacuating somewhere else another day, including Val Meyer was there when that happened, and just whatever the biggest thing was, the Monarch Levee.
Yeah, Monarch Levee was 25 years ago to this day. As a matter of fact, NPR came into our area, needless to say, to cover this monumental event. And Kathy Lohr was the reporter at the time, and she did, this is an excerpt from a piece she did on that event, the Monarch Levee.
Highway 40, which crosses the Missouri River, is one of the main access roads into the city from the west. One of the first levee breaks over the weekend sent the river rushing across the highway, closing the road and bridge. Early this morning, that left just one way over the Missouri, and that turned into a 10-mile backup.
And it is a mess out there right now. It is a total mess. We're looking at Highway 70 right now. Highway 70.
46,000 extra cars and trucks now have to use Highway 70. The traffic gridlock is expected to continue for a couple of weeks until the water recedes enough to reopen Highway 40. That traffic will be a hassle, but the more serious problem is with about 50 propane tanks that are floating in the Mississippi in South St. Louis. The tanks are being held in place only by the pipes that feed gas to them. Divers are trying to release small amounts of propane to relieve pressure on the valves. But after 2 explosions last night, officials aren't taking chances. Police and National Guard today doubled the evacuation area around the plant where the tanks are floating.
That's Kathy Lohr of NPR reporting 25 years ago. Drive out in that area now, Paul Schenkman, and it's hard to believe that there was ever a drop of water in that Chesterfield Valley.
Yeah, it's a little scary, frankly. I don't know enough about levee systems and so forth to know just how sturdy that is, but hopefully for all those folks that went ahead and built out there, it is, although at least it's not housing. It's, big box stores mostly, but if that ever goes again, I mean, the damage is going to be astounding. And I suppose at some point we all end up paying for it through insurance rates or, what have you.
There was a friend of mine who had a property out there, a warehouse, and he went out by boat at one point to check and see, what was left of the place. And he had to go in through the second floor window. That's how high the water was. He stepped through the window, and there was nothing on the floor of that building except snakes. It was like something out of Indiana Jones. The snakes had sought high ground and found it in his building. Mary, how were you reporting or editing these stories back in the day?
Oh, as they came in.
Yeah.
I mean, at the time I was at the Post-Dispatch. They had reporters out everywhere, photographers out everywhere, and it was, and I hate to say this, but we were inundated with the news coverage as well,
and
just
trying
stories,
right?
And there's a real difference too that I think people need to think about. 25 years ago, we didn't have cell phones like we do now and smartphones, so keeping in touch with everyone was very, very difficult.
Paul, how were you reporting it?
Well, I was the I-55 guy, so I was mostly up and down Interstate 55, Festus, Crystal City, St. Jen, up and down that way for weeks on end, it seemed like, which was great in the sense that you got to know the people, but also it was hard to come up with something new every day because at some point, except for when propane tanks break loose or something like that, it's kind of the same story over and over again. For us as reporters, and so you're trying to find something new and find somebody new to talk to. If nothing else, just to quit burdening them. I remember the pastor, again, speaking of the Baptist church on there. I think it was Pastor Adams, as I recall. Great guy. But he was our go-to guy when we couldn't find anybody else to talk to because he was always willing to talk to us, have us come in. I think they had a shelter or something going there. They'd come in and have some food or coffee or whatever. But I remember that. The other thing I remember, too, and I'm sure everybody here had this experience, is that people from out of town just assumed the whole city was flooded. And,
exactly.
Obviously it was, in some select areas. It was big where it happened, and a lot of it was farmland, too. But there was that phenomenon as well.
And we traveled by helicopter back in the day and to get that perspective. And I remember clearly going over that farmland and seeing the bloated bodies of horse and cows and stuff like that animals like that were affected.
Yeah, and what Mary said a moment ago reminded me of that live shot that Dennis Riggs, our colleague, did at Channel 2, where he was in his hip waders up to his hips, I guess, and standing next to a payphone because there were no cell phones back there, and picked it up. I doubt it was working.
Well, we have to say a lot of people made fun of Dennis. As well as he reported the story in those waders, he was always in those waders up to his chest telling people, don't go near the water. It's toxic.
Well, I don't make fun of Dennis now because he's a client of mine. Not that I made fun of him before. But.
Well, and that's a really good point. The flood water, if you're not there, it doesn't really seem like it could be that bad. But when you're there and you smell it and see it, it is just the most atrocious concoction that you could ever be around.
And it's got these colors, too, that you're not familiar with in water. I mean, it's, yellows and greens and things from the fertilizer and whatever that's run off. We have joining us now for a couple of minutes Dave Bussey, who is the Chief of Engineering and Construction Division for the Army Corps of Engineers. Dave, thanks for spending a little time with us.
No problem.
I'd like to ask you what I asked the folks in the studio here at the very beginning. What is your most vivid memory of that summer?
My most vivid memory of that summer was all summer long. It was just the pure duration of that event, which was so much different than anything we've experienced before or after.
And what was the Army Corps doing? I mean, it was almost, you certainly couldn't stop anything, and the levees were being breached all over the place. What could the Corps do?
Well, the Corps actually did quite a bit. They operated the system that was in place, and we have many reservoirs that held back a great deal of water during the flood, or otherwise the crest would have been even higher. But on top of that, they were helping people with their levees. And I think one of the things people sometimes forget is that while it looks like there's a bunch of levees that were all put up separately, they are part of a greater system. And when we talked about those agricultural levees overtopping, and I just heard that, that was as by design, meaning the urban protection projects, the projects that were protecting St. Louis, Wood River, East St. Louis, were built at 54 foot high on the St. Louis gauge, and the lower the levees downstream, for example, Columbia, that did breach. The intent all along was for that to breach before it endangered St. Louis or East St. Louis or Wood River. Much like we had in 2011 on the lower river, and they use the term room for the river. The system is there for those agricultural levees to overtop before they would endanger the major urban protection projects.
What kind of shape are we in now? The Post-Dispatch this morning seemed to suggest that not much has changed, and that may not be a good thing.
I would say several things have changed for the positive, and several things have not changed, which we can talk about later. But the positive things are, I think everyone is more aware of their flood risk. Given that previously our greatest flood was in 1973, and it was 6 feet below where we were in 93, and that we had these massive levees, and there were people that lived behind levees that sometimes didn't even know they had a flood risk. I think we as the Corps and the community as a whole are trying to communicate there's always a risk. There are no perfect levees, and there's always a bigger flood. I can't tell you when that bigger flood will occur, but we know it can. So I think there's a better awareness. And then on a more positive side, both the city of St. Louis and also the Metro East levees that are protecting urban areas all saw in 93 that their levees or flood walls were not as good as they would have hoped they should have been. So they went out and raised money, especially on the Metro East side, where the Flood Protection District raised a sales tax, and they have been improving their levy. And I was clear not to say raising their levies; they were making them stronger, so that if we were, or when we have another 93 or higher, that those levees would be stronger than they were in 93. There were some tense moments in 93. Mostly because of the duration and how long water was on those levees. And I think everyone saw the need to strengthen those. And also, I think based on 93 and then the Katrina episode, we also saw the need for communities to do good evacuation planning so that people understand bad things can happen. So that part has been good. The things that really haven't changed a lot, I would say, would be a desire by a lot of community, society in general, to look to levees to solve their flooding problem. And those are society questions. Those aren't really questions for the Corps. The Corps implements what Congress and the President passes.
You know, Dave, one of the things that occurred to me in getting ready for this program is if we had the same amount of snow melt and the same amount of rain that we had in 93, would the flood be even worse because we have so much more asphalt and concrete down there now that's going to send that water into the storm sewers and into the rivers?
There's a couple things on that. One, I don't think I would worry about the snow melt if it happened at the same time, because as you remember, Don, the flood crusted on August 1st. So most of that snow melt was long into the Gulf, but it did prime the pump. I've heard the argument about increased asphalt and new buildings. That plays it has a much bigger impact on small areas. If you were in a small town and you increase the amount of asphalt, it would increase flooding there. But on a scale that we would have in St. Louis, while there is increased asphalt, and I would say, yes, it would increase it some, but pretty small, because most of the land where water fell is still farmland. There's not a lot of cities. If you look at it, you think of St. Louis, but St. Louis is just a little blip on where the rain fell. Most of it was up in Iowa, Kansas, out in Missouri farmland. But I think the time of the year also has a lot to do with how high the river will go on a certain flow. So there's a lot of things that go into that.
We were talking earlier, Dave Bussey, about the Monarch levee breached 25 years ago to this day. A lot of people ever since have wondered why folks rebuilt out there. And what's your thought about that? I mean, was it a smart thing to do? Is there an ongoing danger out in Chesterfield Valley?
I'll take the easy one first. There is an ongoing risk. There's always a risk. I think even the people that maintain that levee will tell you that there's a risk, and they were trying to minimize it. As a federal employee, as a Corps of Engineer employee, I can not take a stand on if that was wise or unwise. That's a decision for Congress and the President to make.
I'm just wondering if that same level of flooding is still considered a 500-year event, given all the concern we have about the weather conditions these days.
Well, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that. I've heard it was a 500-year flood, but at St. Louis, we're estimating it closer to be about a 350-year flood. But your question's still valid. Do we still think it's a 350-year flood? After the 93 flood, we ran all the data using accepted methods within academia, international, and USGS. And we came up with, we still think it's valid right now. What I would tell you we don't know is, will it be valid 20 years from now? Right now, we have seen a general trend in increasing precipitation. It's been occurring for a little over a century. We've also noticed that the precip comes down in more burst in a shorter period of time, which gives you more runoff. But as of today, I would say that number is probably pretty good. But if that trend continues where precipitation continues to increase, runoff continues to increase, I would expect that number would change. The Corps' policy is traditionally to relook at this after at least every major flood, if not sooner. I think I was on this very radio cast at the 25th anniversary, and we talked about there would probably be a need to relook at it. Professionally, I think it will change some at the upper end, But given that 93 was so unusual, it's still 6 feet higher than the second highest that's ever occurred. It still has more days above 40 feet, which I would consider a pretty major flood, than the rest of the time in St. Louis combined. So it was not only unusual from a height perspective, 6 feet over the second highest, but also in duration, that it just stayed above 40 feet for so long.
Dave, I know your time is limited. I have one other question, though, relating to the 500-year flood. If I remember correctly, back in the early 70s, there were 2 100-year floods back-to-back, which means that these things can happen like that.
You could get 2 100-year floods back-to-back without question. It's a 1 in 100 chance it could occur in any given year. But I would tell you sometimes those numbers get thrown around a lot. For example, the second highest flood we've ever had by height was 1973, and that's estimated to be about a 75-year flood. So while I've been alive, other than 1993, at St. Louis, we have not had a 100-year flood other than 1993. Even 73, which was second highest, was considered to be less than that.
Yeah.
Now, maybe on the Missouri or further up on the Upper Miss, they could occur. But if we're talking about St. Louis, we've only had one flood in my lifetime that's been above 100-year, and that's 1993.
Well, we do know that there will be more floods. Whether they're 500-year floods, 100-year floods, or 75-year floods, we're going to get more of them. Dave Bussey, thank you so much for spending some time with us. I know you're a very busy guy.
Thank you.
Thank you. What do you think of what Mr. Bussey had to say?
Well, it just reminds me that floods are one of those disasters that at least you see is coming. There's not that much you can do about it if it's as bad as it was. But I remember it was the 4th of July weekend that summer, and we were down on the riverfront overlook covering what was back then the VP Fair. And after the fireworks show and the whole thing was over, I said to my boss, who happened to be standing there, "What do you think we're going to cover now that all this is over?" And he took one look at the river and pointed at it, and he goes, "That." And he was right.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take a break now. We have a number of people calling in and want to get in on the conversation. We'll do that in just a moment. We're remembering the Great Flood of 1993. Give us a call if you have a recollection you'd like to share with us. 382-8255 is the number. That's 382-TALK. Send us an email to talk@stlpublicradio.org, or if you prefer to go the tweet route, it's STL on air. This is St. Louis on the air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Thank you for listening to this St. Louis on the Air podcast supported by University College at Washington University, with undergraduate and graduate programs part-time, evening, and online. University College at Washington University, offering world-class education within reach.
Now back to our conversation about the flood of 93 with Mary Leonard of St. Louis Public Radio, Paul Shankman, owner of Paul Shankman Productions, and Bill Greenblatt, photographers for United Press International. Mary, let me come back to you because you've been spending a lot of time on the Valmeyer story, the relocated town, if you will. Bring us up to speed on the Valmeyer story.
Well, Valmeyer still is a case study in terms of what happens after a major flood like this. The entire village relocated up the bluffs, up to the top of the bluffs, and to get out of the floodplain. And, you know, it's remarkable, really. It was a village of about 900 people, and they together, the residents there banded together. They bought land, and they moved up to the top of the bluffs. And, 20 years later, go to Valmeyer, you don't even see any sign that there was an old Valmeyer, really, because so many of the old structures were bought by FEMA and torn down. It's almost impossible when you're in the old village to even get a sense of there used to be a village here. But the new village up on top of the bluffs, it's like a planned community. It's everything was built in the, 95 to even some current construction now. There's about 1,200 people live there. It's a nice village, but they have not forgotten the 25th anniversary.
A little bit of a silver lining to that awful story of 25 years ago.
It was tough on those people, though. Sure. I mean, they were sandbagging for weeks, trying to save their village because, as you point out, you knew the flood was coming, and they thought the levees would hold because the levees had held for 50 years. Mm-hmm. And they sandbagged for weeks and weeks and weeks, but when the breach occurred north of them in Columbia, they knew the water was coming.
I mentioned Kathy Lohr of NPR in a piece that she did 25 years ago. Here's how she reported the Valmeyer story back then.
Whether Valmeyer can be brought back to life is the question now. Not much is going on in the town anymore. The post office has moved to Waterloo, about 10 miles away. The barber's there, too. The local bank is operating out of a place called Dreamland Palace, an old restaurant and dance hall about 5 miles away in Foster Pond. Valmeyer's residents are staying with relatives or friends, or they found shelter in other small towns nearby. Without basic services like water and electricity, the mayor says it's been hard on everyone.
These people have been put out of their homes. A lot of them are in temporary shelters. A lot of them have no idea where their belongings are, and their families are split apart, and they're looking for some type of order in their life, and they can't find it here at this point.
A report by Kathy Lohr of NPR 25 years ago during the flood of 93, which we are talking about on this program today. One of the very saddest stories, out of many sad stories, Bill Greenblatt, I'll turn to you, Greenblatt, I should say, and that was the awful tragedy at Cliff Cave Park, where these youngsters went in incredibly during this period to explore the cave and never came out. What's your recollection of that story?
Well, those kids were hiking and went in, and by the time we got down there, or most of the media, they had that was all cordoned off, and we couldn't get in to see anything. It was all flooded, but it was just a big police presence and a terrible tragedy.
A lot of criticism for the fact that happened because it happened during the time of this flooding. Right. Who would go in, reminiscent of the thing we just went through in Asia with those kids. Paul, do you have any recollection of that story?
I wasn't on that one. I just remember, how awful it was. Yeah. And I was surprised when I saw in the paper, I guess it was yesterday, and I think you mentioned at the top of the show, that 50 people died as a result of the flood. I didn't remember that the number was that high. I suppose in some respects it's surprising it wasn't higher, but...
Well, I'm not sure the 50 people were all in
50
this area.
were throughout.
Right.
It was in the 9 states. Exactly. But in Missouri, the flood deaths, I think it was like 27 people afterward they attributed to the flood, some directly and some indirectly. And that tragedy that you're talking about at the cave was a significant portion of the casualties. A number of the people that are included in that casualty number are people who were driving on areas where flash flooding occurred. And so I think one of the things we've seen since 93 is that there are many more alerts warning people of flooding and flash flooding to prevent that kind of
Well, the flash flooding, which covers a dip in the road, that's what happens. People think the road is level and they drive through it and suddenly they're 12 feet underwater. Okay, one of the things that I remember that I just wanted to get your take on, the River des Peres is never more than a trickle. Often you don't see any water in there at all. But don't you remember how deep that was? And it went over the banks and was up to the windowsills on houses on either side of that River des Peres. Incredible.
Well, they closed Borgenford because the water had reached the street there. But most of the damage was down at Alabama when a MSG pumping station quit. And I was standing in a car wash watching this wall of water coming down. And down there, bars and restaurants and things like that were flooded.
Well, the river water was so high that it had no place to go, so it pushed up the River des Peres. It was going in the opposite direction than it normally would.
That's so true. It was the tributaries that were causing so much of the inland flooding. And that's why I think people had this perception that the whole area was underwater because of the Mississippi and the Missouri, but in fact, some of that flooding was due to the tributaries.
Yeah, it backed up first into the Canteen Creek, and that's what took out Lemay down there.
Well, I think you may recall, I think it was Channel 2 that put out a poster that had those two satellite photos before and during, and that really made you think about it when you saw just how swollen all those rivers were and everything else that showed up on that map. That was a lot of water.
A lot of water. Let's take some calls. We'll start with Ron. He's been waiting the longest. We thank you for your patience, Ron. You're on the air.
Hey, I wanted to give a shout-out to the Missouri National Guard. I was the commander of B Company, 1138th Engineer Battalion, 35th Engineer Brigade, and we worked the last 3 weeks of the flood of 93, so we worked all the way from Bell Fountain Neighbors to Crystal City. And one of the last things we did was we reinforced the levee in Crystal City, which we believed helped save Crystal City Kimmswick from going under. And so the Missouri National Guard across the entire state did a great job.
Thank you, Ron, for your call. And, yeah, the National Guard was very busy and did a lot of real good work at that time. You know, I think the flood wall, Bill, you might remember this, in St. Louis, protecting St. Louis, was put up in the 60s. Mm-hmm. And had that not been put up at the time, downtown would have been underwater.
Yeah, I remember a lot of the cities in Illinois and downstream from St. Louis had criticized St. Louis because of the flood wall.
Yeah.
And that the water was going into their
Squeezed
areas.
It.
Right.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
yeah. Okay, let's take another call. Sandra is calling from St. Genevieve. Sandra, thank you for waiting. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Don. I just am very excited that you're addressing this topic on your show today, and wanted to put in just a note about St. Genevieve, and in particular with your St. Louis area listeners. There were thousands of volunteers and the National Guard from St. Louis area and across the state. Really, people came from around the world to help sandbag in St. Genevieve. And as you may recall, of course, St. Genevieve was saved, and a big part of that emphasis were the irreplaceable historic homes and properties that are here that date to the 1700s. And I thought your audience might be excited to know that last week we hosted representatives from the National Park Service, and some of those very homes, notably the Amaro House, which is along St. Mary's Road, and properties adjacent to that, such as the Beckett-Rabot House and others, will be at the heart of a future National Park historic site. And so that is thrilling for us here in St. Genevieve, that not only were those historic properties able to be saved during the August 93 flood, but also that they will now be recognized and preserved in a National Park historic site. And so I wanted to put a plug in that St. Genevieve, our crest was on August 6, 1993 at 49.67 feet. And so our 25th anniversary is coming up. And the weekend after the anniversary happens to be our largest festival of the year, which is the St. Genevieve Jour de Fête. So we hope that...
Sandra, you've got a lot going on, and we've got not too much time, but we understand what's going on in St. Genevieve, and as always, it's going to be a great time and a great town. Thank you so much for your call. You know, she mentions the sandbaggers, and what a tremendous job sandbaggers did, the community coming together during that time. I'm sure you took more than one picture of people.
A lot of pictures in front of the stoplight in Crystal City with Dick Gephardt filling sandbags.
And as Paul points out, it was so hot. Yeah. That was like a record-setting heat that July.
Yeah, it was just miserable. But, you know, one of the things, too, that sticks out in my mind is that there's always this sort of bromide about, you know, neighbors helping neighbors, and only here in the Midwest would that happen. I can't think of too many places where that wouldn't happen. Thank goodness they all showed up, and it was amazing, you know, how much they put in, to, you know, for places that had no connection to them except that they saw on the news that people needed help. I think that would happen just about
anywhere.
And
they still do. And that, you know, as you point out, we still have floods. They're not as big, thank heavens, but we have flooding a lot. And people still show up, and I think that's just remarkable.
We have an email here from Steve, who writes, "One afternoon as I was watching the TV news, I saw a couple of St. Louis Blues players helping with the sandbagging in the Lee May area, not far from where I lived in '93. I was jolted out of a feeling of helplessness by a couple of guys from Canada, Nelson Emerson and Kelly Chase. The next day I went down by the old Lee May Bank headquarters and pitched in. For hours I filled and stacked sandbags in the July or August heat. In spite of the ultimate failure of our massive effort, I have always been proud of that effort. I also wish to thank Chase and Emerson for goading me into action that summer." That's kind of representative of the way people were brought into service during that time. Go back to the phones. Another thought from you guys before I go back? Okay, let's go to Anna, I guess it is, in St. Louis. Anna, go ahead.
Yes, hi. The winter before the summer of '93, I was in Mount Shasta, California, and there was a huge snowstorm that started on Christmas Day, dumping 2 feet every day for several days. We ended up with 10 to 15 feet of snow in the town of Mount Shasta, and all across the Northwest there were huge snowstorms that were piling up snow up north as we went into that part of the year. In the springtime in Mount Shasta, a lot of rain came and washed both rain and snow melt, created huge flooding in Sacramento and Russian rivers. We left Mount Shasta in mid-July and drove back to St. Louis, and by that time the snows up in Minnesota and up north in North Dakota and all those places that feed both the Mississippi and the Missouri River were starting to melt down, and the rivers were filling. When we got to Kansas City, we actually saw the crest of the flood on the Missouri River. When we got to Boonville, the water was rising, and we looked over a bridge and saw all kinds of cars and tanks and all kinds of polluting things and animals floating down the river. My son and I actually stopped in a park and watched as water was coming up a road, and we rescued probably 100 or more earthworms that were seeking dry land. And when we got back to St. Louis, all we could do after all of that was just to watch the news and take care of our own business because we had a house to get ready for somebody to move into. But it was a really big deal for that whole summer, and I agree with you that the heat was intense, and I really admire all the people that were able to help and all the courage of the people that had to go through that personally.
Let me stop you there, Anna. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are running short of time. But we appreciate your recollections, and quite a summer it was. It was a big deal, no question about it. But thank you for the call.
And it went on. I mean, as a story, it went on for a long time.
100 days
after the water went down. Sure. I mean, it takes a long time to recover from any sort of disaster, but flooding has got to be right up there near the top because it just does so much damage.
And I think people sometimes forget there was a second round of flooding that came in. For example, in Valmeyer, they thought they were going to be able to rebuild the town. But another round of flooding came in. I think it was in August, September. So they had the initial water go down. They got out. They started working on their houses, and then the river came back again. And I think that, we sometimes tend to forget that it did go on for a very, very long time.
Yeah. Anna and others have commented on the people who came to assist during these trying times. But, Paul, you did a piece, and we have a clip from it. I'll ask you to set it up. But it really speaks to the resolve and the resignation at the same time.
It does. And the fact we had mentioned before that a lot of the people who were affected by this were farmers. I got off of I-55 for a special that we did, an hour-long special in the height of all of this. And the assignment that I had was to go and spend an entire day with a farm family that was under threat of water. And so we found the Lindhorst family just on the other side of the J.B. Bridge in the Columbia Bottoms over there. And we did a long piece. This is just about a 1-minute section of the last part of it. The radio won't do it justice because the pictures are beautiful in one sense and also sort of arresting and alarming in another sense as you see the water starting to creep in across their fields and they're sitting there wondering what to do. But you meet such amazing people when you go out on these stories, the people helping out that we've mentioned, but also the people going through it and their resolve, as you mentioned. And I thought that this clip sort of spoke to that as it comes to the end of it.
You can hear the strength of these folks.
The Lindhorsts have every piece of farm equipment imaginable, but they have no tool, no machinery capable of fixing this. A lifetime of work is at risk from what really isn't even a once-in-a-lifetime event. As evening falls, the county fair seems a good place to forget the bad that surrounds them. Tomorrow could bring ruin, but this day will end like it began, with the sun shimmering across fields that should be full instead of fallow.
You know, you've got to keep going some way or another, so if you let yourself get down too far, and then it might make matters worse.
You know what they always tell me? Where you lose it, that's where you find it. And that is so. If you lose your pocket knife, you're going to find it where you lost it. So you just go back the next year and raise another crop. See, you might find it all then, see?
That was one of my favorite stories of the flood, just because of the resolve that these folks had that they're going to stay and defend the land. You know, it was, I don't know how many years ago now, but in the piece, one of the people that we talked to was a boy who was 10 years old at the time, the youngest member of the family. And I ran into him. Somewhere. I obviously would have recognized him, because he was a grown man with children, I think, at that point. But he said that the family really enjoyed being in the piece, which really touched me, because you always feel like you're sort of imposing on these people when you come in and do it. And they were absolutely wonderful to work with that day, and we spent all day with them. I'm sure they were ready to get rid of us by the end of the day. But that's always nice to hear, too.
Yeah. Bill, did you by any chance get down to the to Illinois, Prairie du Rocher, and places like that?
I did, just for a day or two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember that story with regard to how they had to breach the levee on purpose in order to tell what you recall of that?
I don't remember a lot about that. I just remember that they did breach the levee.
And they caused the water to go around the town of Prairie du Rocher as opposed to flooding it, which was imminent.
They did that down in Poplar Bluff a few years ago, too, by exploding some levees.
Yeah.
They took a real risk when they did that.
Absolutely.
And I remember just reading about it here recently, because it's south of Valmeyer. As the water kept on down the floodplain, that historic village, Prairie du Rocher, was in great danger. Mm-hmm. And so they took a shot, and they basically breached a levee and diverted the water, and they saved the historic buildings there.
And I think, I may be remembering this wrong, and if I do, I apologize to the folks in Rocher, as they call it down there, as I learned, is that at one point I think they had to bag all these sandbags, and they had moved it to, I don't know if it was a cave or a quarry or something, where it was really cool inside, which I thought was ingenious, given how hot it was. And they were filling all the sandbags in there and then taking them by truck down.
They did that in Valmeyer.
Was that where it was?
Yes.
Maybe I'm thinking of Valmeyer.
You're thinking of Rock City. It's called Rock City now. Yes.
I remember at Prairie du Rocher, the media, of course, were coming in helicopters by droves, and the water was so high that they waved the helicopters away because they thought the downwash from the helicopters would cause the water to breach the levee. Okay, let's go back to the, speaking of blowing up levees, I think Roger has a story to make a point here. Go ahead, Roger, you're on the air.
Okay, thanks. Well, this Prairie du Rocher, and the locals there do call it Rocher because that's where my folks are from. And so I know when that happened, there was a creek coming down from the hills above Rocher, which is just a little bit upstream and across the Mississippi River from St. Genevieve. But this creek came down out of the hills, and then on either side of the creek to the Mississippi River were these levees. And so the river had gone up into that creek, and it was the levee on the upside. Again, the water that flowed down and had inundated Waymire was flowing inside of the main levee, heading straight for Rocher. And what they did was blew up the upstream levee to allow the water to seep in from the creek side and inundate that part of the floodplain, and gradually moved up and then met the oncoming water rushing downstream from Waymire. But what was incredible about it was their decision to do that. And, of course, it was filled with risk. It saved that town because that floodwater coming down from Valmeyer would have just blown through both of those creek levees like they were nothing. And that's an incredible part of the whole story.
Roger, yes, it is. Needless to say, there was another breach, but of a different sort, up in the Quincy area, in which a fellow who wanted to isolate his wife while he was partying blew a levee, and he was sentenced to life in prison for doing that. Recall that story? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I do. I remember how astounding it was in the midst of all this, with everybody trying to save, that somebody would do that, and then for such an insane reason. Yeah. Just unbelievable.
Another visual that I have, Bill, and all of you here, is the situation out in Gumbo at the airport, the Spirit Airport out there, with planes bobbing around in the water like corks. Were you out there?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Took a rowboat because it wasn't really that deep, but because there was corn growing, and you had to row and use small motors and things like that to get out there. So,
yeah. More than one reporter was in a boat during the course of that summer.
Well, I guess the iconic image of the flood is the Gummersheimer house floating down the river.
We talked about that before we went on the air, and the fact that the water came in the front door, went out the back, and took the house with it. That was an incredible story. Mm-hmm. I went back there a year later to do a story on Virgil, and all that was left of that property was sand and silt. The house obviously was long gone, but it reminded me of what Bikini Atoll might have been like when they tested the first atomic bomb. It was just sand. There was nothing, no foliage at all. Anyway, another call here. Ann in St. Louis, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi. I was moving into a new house along the River Des Peres right at the time that second batch of the flood came, and my house literally backs up to the River Des Peres, and everyone was warning me about moving there. And yet, I'm way up north near the Metrolink station, and just south of me, it was just so flooded that, people had to move out. So I had some people over, and one man walked back to my fence, and he looked down at the water, which was way down where I am, and he said, "Oh, wow, waterfront property."
I think that's a point that is important for people to remember, too. There were places that flooded that hadn't flooded for decades. And, I think sometimes people look at people during the flood and they say, well, they live on the river. What do you expect? Mm-hmm. And that was the point, I think, that I came away with, is so many folks had lived in communities. In Valmeyer, for example, you couldn't even see the river from the old village. You couldn't even see it. So, and they had the levee system. When some of these villages and communities flooded, it was basically hadn't happened for 50, 60 years.
And yet I imagine a lot of them went back.
They often do, and most of the time they do. I think you have time for one more quick call. This will bring us into 2018. David in St. Louis, you're on the air. Go ahead. Go ahead, David.
Well, thanks. I'm remembering not only the 93 flood, but I'm not sure if it was 2014 or 15 when the Missouri River flooded. And that later flood was directly tied to global warming. The mountains in the upper Missouri, up in Montana and Wyoming and whatnot, the snows melted so fast, and every snow that followed that spring melted within hours. And so there was a huge flood that not only endangered the two nuclear power plants near Omaha, but that it flooded the entire Missouri River. So the politicians that are ignoring and denying global warming are putting us at risk. And I'm very concerned that this chatter, this rhetoric that global warming is a hoax, they're not only lying about protecting polluters is what these politicians are doing. And global warming is real, and it's putting us at risk to ignore it.
David, thank you so much for the call. Global warming had to come up during this conversation, don't you think? Very limited time left. Any final thought very quickly, Mary Lynette?
Well, on Thursday we have a piece that I did on Valmeyer. And I hope people might enjoy listening to some of the residents talk about 25 years ago and where they are now.
Very quickly, Paul, a final thought?
Well, we live in a city that's almost surrounded entirely by rivers, so we can expect this will happen again. Hopefully the gentleman from the Corps is right, and it'll be 350 years from now, and it won't be our problem.
Hopefully.
The thing I take away from the flood is I didn't know, and I don't think anybody knew how big the enormity of this flood was, because we do flood all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And just going in West Alton and watching caskets float down the river were
incredible
something
time.
I'll always remember.
Bill Greenblatt, thank you for being with us. Paul Shankman, Maryland, thank you all so much for helping us remember 1993. You can find more flood-related stories on a special section of our website, 25 Years Later, Remembering the Great Flood of 93. Just go to stlpublicradio.org. St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU. Thank you for listening. I'm Don Marsh.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.